So we'll talk a little bit about patterns inside of patterns. We're not going to get into more array patterns yet. We'll touch on that when we get to using the 4-color process with screen printing, with a 4-color screen print process. So I was saying that pattern inside of pattern, that could be an issue if you're using an amplitude modulation printing process. So what do I mean a pattern inside of pattern? Well, if you're printing on a cloth, for example, that would be an issue, but also something like this. Here's a 1928 painting, The False Mirror by I'm going to say this wrong, hold on. Magritte, I think I got that right, Magritte. He's the guy, hold on, he's the guy who did the apple painting. Magritte, apple painting. Here he is. You remember this one? This shows up all the time in abstract artwork, or surrealism artwork. Anywho, he also did this lovely piece, The False Mirror. Now this is out of an art history book, which means that it's a photo of an oil painting, yeah? And it's been reproduced in some way. Well, it's been reproduced using essentially a 4-color printing process. So this is a photo of a painting, but then that photo is printed and then I scanned it. So what are we really looking at? Well, let's start zooming in a lot, like a whole lot. Oh my, what have we here? Now, these look a little familiar, don't they? We have some white paper and we have these dots creating a gradation from essentially a gray to a white. And if we zoom back out, we see that's in the eye. Those are our little screen printing process. Now, we'll get into this in a little bit, but essentially this is a rosette pattern that's being applied in order to produce the color. We'll deal with that in a bit. If we come in over here, we see that it's mostly black. And if we come over here, we can see this is what the rosette pattern starts to look like. And again, we'll talk about that later. It has to do with how you do color. When we get to the color, we'll get into that. But essentially, this was at one point an oil painting, but then it was a photo, which is a chemical process, which wouldn't have these dots. It would actually have a grain much similar, more similar to the frequency modulation printing. But then that photograph was reproduced in a book, and so they had to use these little dot process. Essentially, it was printed using this process. So when I scanned it in, I picked all of that up. Now, what would happen if I took this scan and I turned it into a t-shirt by using that long process I was talking about, and I did these 4 colors and I stomped everything on one at a time and all of that good stuff? Well, because it was already a pattern, when I run it through this thing, it's going to be a really obvious and pretty bad pattern. It's going to have all kinds of issues, not just the moire effect, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, but it would also exasperate the entire pattern process. So you'd see all these dots and it'd be a big mess. So if I really only had this scan to work off of, what if it's an old newspaper clipping, right? And I really want to have it not look like a newspaper clipping. Well, there are a lot of processes you could run through Photoshop. But if you were doing something with this frequency modulation instead, it would obscure a lot of that pattern because there's not really a line print to speak of. It's literally just kind of plopping down this ink. And where you'd see these things a lot of times would be on these large inkjet printers, if you've seen them. The huge format, the wide format inkjet printers, the ones that can do like banner prints and that kind of stuff. A lot of those, in fact, I think maybe these days all of them are using these FM frequencies. Well, that's not true. There's some new technology that does some crazy stuff too. But a lot of them are going to use this FM printing process. So you're not going to have to worry about a line count or anything of that sort. So what do you have to worry about instead? Well, other issues can come up. So how do you deal with them? Well, it's a printer by printer basis. You're going to want to make samples and work with whoever's running the printer. And if that's you, you're going to want to print a lot of samples at different resolutions to see what you're doing. Now, that said, if you're using this FM printing process instead, you don't need as high resolution. Like, honestly, 300 is going to be amazing. But you could probably squeak by with like half that, 150, and you'll be probably in the clear. But again, it depends on the system you're printing. So if it's using a different printer and I want to say Ripper, but I've written this down specifically, so I'll say it correctly. The raster image profile process, if the printer has that system in it, if it's abstracted out over there, then you'll need to experiment with it, find out what settings it is. You're going to need to read some manuals, watch some YouTube videos. You're going to want to work with it. But if you're not the one working with it, you're probably going to want to call up whoever's actually running the thing, and they'll probably know what they're doing, right? They have all this expensive equipment, but you want to ask if they're using a halftone dot pattern, and if they are using a halftone dot pattern, if it's an AM pattern, what the screen the line screen is, so you can figure out probably want twice as much. Ask them if they want you to prepare it, or if they're going to prepare it. They may need you to turn these things into a bitmap, which is a whole ordeal, and I'll show you that in just a second. Or they may handle that themselves. They may want you to split everything up according to CMYK channels, in which case you'll need to do that, or they may handle it, but you'll want to ask all those questions. If it's an FM print, ask them what file resolution it should be, because that's going to make a big difference. If they only want a 200 pixel per inch, don't make them resize that. They'll charge you for that. You're going to want to resize everything in advance and have it all ready to go. So I said a bitmap just now, right? We've got this this false mirror process. What if we had a flat out photograph though? Pop on over. Haha, it's our snail of science. So everything in Photoshop is technically a bitmap, correct? Because it's we get down there, it's what, like in RGB case, it has the red, green, blue. It may also have an alpha if you have a transparency in there, so you have some bits of information, and then you end up with 256 bits, so you can get all those gradations across all those channels, all that stuff. But there's another term in Photoshop. If we were to go over to image and mode, you'll notice we've got bitmap, but this thing's always knocked out. And that's because in order to go to a bitmap, you actually have to be in a grayscale mode first. But what do I always say? Don't just go to grayscale mode. Always make sure that you start with a black and white. So we'll do black and white so that we can maybe do some on-screen adjustments and, set things up how we want it so it looks really good. And then once we're happy with everything, then switch it to the grayscale. That gives you total control over it. So I'm going to go to image, mode, grayscale, and it's going to say changing the mode will discard an adjustment layer. Do you want to change the mode anyway? Yeah, go ahead and flatten everything. All right, and now it says discard your color information to control the conversion. Use image adjustments black and white. Well, we already did that, so go ahead and discard that. Now we're in grayscale. So if we check out our channels, we just have the one channel now. It's no longer RGB, it's just flat out grayscale. Once we've done this, we have unlocked the power of bitmap. So let me go ahead and save this real quick so that we don't accidentally lose it somewhere. I'll just toss it on the desktop real quick. Boom. New, and we'll call this hello. We'll call this grayscale. Always save, everyone, constantly. What file size? Well, don't compress it. Make it maximum there. All right, so we've got the grayscale. Ooh. So now let's do bitmap conversion. This is where things get interesting. When you go to image mode bitmap, things suddenly change. It says, well, what output do you want? Well, what output did I have? Let's find out first. We've got image size. The original resolution was 72. Okay, so we won't be upsampling or anything. Image, mode, bitmap. So 72 would probably be okay. But what was I saying? We really want 300, right? If we have 150 line count. So let's come back to our original image size. I'm not going to resample. I'm just going to crank this up to 300 resolution, which will shrink down the overall size because now 300 pixels have to go into making an inch instead of 72. So all of a sudden, instead of the incredibly high number of 60 by 45 inches, without resample on, I'm cranking this up to 300, which gives us, boom, 14 by 10 inches. Same number of pixels, is the same pixel count. It's still 4,320 by 3,240, but it's small. It's fewer inches because we're using more of them per inch. All right, now that we've done all that, we can come back to our bitmap because, ta-da, output 300. Now there are a few things here. We have 50%. We have what method? Well, what is all this? 50% threshold, pattern dither, diffusion dither? Well, halftone screen, we've been talking about that. Custom pattern. Well, the diffusion dither is essentially our FM frequency. Check that out, our FM frequency, our frequency modulation print. Ta-da! Pretty wild, right? Let me undo that. So now we're just back to our normal pixels. I'm going to go to image mode and bitmap again. That's what undo did. You also have the pattern dither. And the pattern dither is going to use this pattern to try to create it. Now this is a default pattern, but you can actually use your own pattern. And if you recall, we've mastered how to create and use patterns. So if we go to image mode, bitmap again, if we pop over to, I just want to cover all these real quick because we're not going to be coming back to this. Let's say we used the, what would be a good one from a while back? This crazy black and white pattern from forever ago, pattern 9. Tell it okay. Look at that. It's using this glitch pattern to produce everything. And so if you made a pattern of like a face or the snail as a pattern, any of those things, it would make that tiny little face or snail or whatever, that image that you captured as a pattern, it would do that to create it would have different amounts of darkness and lightness to try to create this in black and white, which is crazy, but a fun effect. Anyway, all that aside, we got 2 more. Let's take a look. We have the 50% threshold, and literally that's just threshold set to 50%. So it's a black or white process. You notice we have some almost FM style print there. Let me undo that again, put it back to grayscale, and go to image mode, bitmap. Every time I undo, I'm just moving it back to grayscale and undoing what I've done. Last one here, halftone screen. Tell it okay. Woo! Okay. Frequency. All right. So what's it usually talking about here for the frequency? I've been told this, and you'll want to double check with whoever you're printing with, or if you're doing it yourself, just do a couple of tests here. I've been told it should be 1/5 of whatever your screen count is. So let's kick open our calculator real quick. And on our massive calculator, we have 150 line count. Whoops. We will divide that by 5. So it's going to say 30. Cool. Sounds good. 30. Now, I said that I had an angle of 45 way back when I showed you that, and it made that nice stair-step approach. So we'll leave that. We'll talk more about angle in a bit. That's going to be important. Now you have different shapes. Usually you'll want either round or ellipse. Most of the recommendations I get are round. You also have choices of diamonds and squares and crosses and all kinds of lines, all kinds of fun stuff. For now, let's just do a round so I can show you what this will look like. This is the frequency is lines per inch. Tell it okay. Let's zoom in. Check that out. We've got our snail. Now, did you notice something? If I pop open the history window here, wherever H is alphabetically organized, our image looks just a tad darker. Not a whole lot. It's actually pretty good. But a lot of times, as you go in to do the bitmap, you'll have to bring up levels first and just lighten everything up a little bit. And then when you perform the bitmap process, halftone screen, they'll bring up the second window here. It will look about as dark as it was originally. Why did I close the history window? I need that. So before, after, that's about the same amount of brightness. Maybe a little too light, but about the same amount. It didn't get too much darker. Okay, so just for fun, let's take a look at, now we will close the history window. Just for fun, let's take a look at another shape. We'll go to image mode bitmap, and we will take a look at our halftone screen. Tell it okay to get to our next window. We'll leave the line count and everything the same. We're going to do a line. Doesn't look like anything happened until we go in. Now you can see that 45-degree angle. Did everything in a line style. And we could go in and use instead the bitmap and do a halftone screen and pop it on over. And we could do a square, for example. And that produces these little squares. And you can see they fill in more or less going in, which has an interesting effect, probably not too useful in our case. And just in case you don't get a chance to do it yourself, let's take a look at the last couple here. We've got the diamond, very much like the square, but because it's a 45-degree angle, the square was a diamond and the diamond's a square. That's really all that they are, is they're slightly rotated. And then if we go to bitmap, we can switch on over and take a look at, bitmap, halftone screen. Okay, I always think this window is going to be one higher. We could do a cross, and it's just these little X's essentially, and that's because, again, they're at a 45-degree angle. And one more, image mode bitmap, the one that's actually probably more important, halftone. Let's take a look at ellipse. So normally round, but what's ellipse do? Notice it's just a little bit longer. So yeah, that's about it. That's how you would normally convert into a bitmap prior to sending it off to be printed using a screen printing process. And so if you were going to print this yourself by buying your own enamel, your own screen, your own frame, and stapling all that together and getting a squeegee and a ink and, you know, stapling all that where you need it and getting the light photosensitive enamel and printing everything on a piece of plastic and running it under UV light and all that good stuff. If you've done all that yourself, you're probably going to need to go through this bitmapping process in order to do it. And if you're doing it in multiple color, you'd have to do it a few times. We'll talk about that in a bit. But for this assignment, we're actually going to not do that, because when I try to make it any more complicated than it is, immediately it's so much to juggle the first time through that students start having a really hard time. So instead, I want you guys to concentrate on making a graphic that will look good once you finish the output process. So keep in mind, you may need to go back and do a lot of rework to your initial graphic. So what we're going to do instead is actually use a halftone pattern under the pixelate. But before we get into all of that, it's about time to talk about the 4-color process. So we'll do that in the next video. I'll see you in a minute.